Hi, and welcome to Across the Canon. My name is Brian, and if you're watching this, it's probably because you love the Bible and learning more about the way the entire story flows together. Thanks for joining us for this episode. In this episode, we're going to be looking at the question: Did Jesus establish a priesthood? And if so, what's the nature of that priesthood? And if that priesthood was established, why do we not see the New Testament referring to Christian leaders with that same Old Testament term for priest? We're joined today by Father Anthony Giambrone of the Order of Preachers, and we'll be discussing his book, The Bible and the Priesthood: Priestly Participation in the One Sacrifice for Sins. This book is part of the series A Catholic Biblical Theology of the Sacraments by Baker Academic. Father Anthony, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So, why don't you give us a little bit about your background? Where'd you come from? How did you end up becoming a biblical scholar who is living in Jerusalem doing biblical scholarship? That sounds like a dream for a lot of people.
A dream or a nightmare, maybe. It's yeah. So I grew up in Ohio. I joined, as you said, the Dominican Order, the Order of Preachers, after a short stint in the seminary for my Archdiocese of Cincinnati. And because of that short stint, I was a little ahead in my theology. It's a philosophy already. And before I was ordained in the order, they needed to do something with me. And my superiors had the bright idea to send me across the street to Catholic University of America there in Washington and do Semitic languages and things like that. So that's how the scripture thing started. And it was kind of top down. I basically didn't say no, and have enjoyed a surprising ride. I went to Notre Dame, then eventually I did license in Rome. I did my PhD at Notre Dame, and then I got a call from our provincial the day after my doctoral defense, expecting him to say congratulations, which he did eventually manage to say. But the first thing was just that he got a letter from the Master of the Order in Rome, and I was going to Jerusalem. That's kind of how that happened. We have a pretty illustrious institute here, the École Biblique, which is really at the root of modern Catholic biblical study. So anyway, I've been here now for 8 years, and I teach New Testament, and I'm also the vice director here.
So, what is that like doing scholarship, biblical scholarship in the Holy Land, right? I mean, that's got to shape your experience a little bit differently than literally anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I mean that's absolutely true, and that's the reason why this place was founded here. I was telling you before. I mean, you can have a library anywhere in the world, and even an excellent one. But the point here is that you have this proximity, especially to the material culture, the archaeology. So from the very beginning, that was always a big emphasis here at the École. It's the École Biblique et Archéologique. So that's even kind of half the identity. I'm just coming a couple minutes ago from our epigraphy lab and editing Greek inscriptions and so forth. So that proximity, that immediacy to the biblical past makes a giant, imprint on your scholarship, just also on your person at a personal level as well. I'm a 4-minute walk from the Holy Sepulchre. I mean, it's a pretty extraordinary context to work in. It's a challenging context to work in, more than ever now, but invigorating.
I can imagine. I can only imagine. And so, speaking of, Catholic biblical scholarship and the way we read scripture, as we get into, this book that you've put together, your opening chapter, I think, was really helpful where you discuss the Catholic approach to scripture, right? So we've had the Second Vatican Council that really does lay out some guidelines for what good biblical exegesis should be aiming towards. So could you take us, through a little bit of, as a Catholic biblical scholar, what are some of the guardrails, right? What's the aim that we're going for here when it comes to biblical interpretation and biblical scholarship?
Yeah. Um, it's a good question. I think the De Verbum lays out a series of clear principles, four principles. Though the implementation or even to understand those principles is maybe a work in progress.
Mhm.
We've had a generation and a half, maybe two generations to try and work it out in the concrete. The big vision, and this was already something that Father Lagrange, who founded the École out here, saw and promoted, is, I mean, to unite historical study and a theological approach. So, I mean, there's a kind of major symmetry there that's meant to inform the work that we do. So, as much as you do the Greek inscriptions and so forth, an actual dogmatic commitment and interest is also essential to the kind of robust Catholic vision. Um, the four elements that De Verbum ultimately articulates uh, maybe expose the asymmetry of that symmetry. So I mean, there's this one element of the historical context and understanding the text in that historical context, and there's a lot of dimensions in the interior of that. I mean, the languages themselves. I mean, historical philology, the character of ancient texts, and so forth. You can do a lot to open that up, and that's been most of the focus over the last couple generations at a minimum, and so it probably deserves or requires less glossing than the more theological elements, which are three. So one would be the unity of
Mhm.
the entirety of the scriptures. That's a very suggestive idea. I mean, the name of your podcast here, Across the Canon, is
Mhm.
already indicative of some of that. And I have my own kind of thoughts, also experimental, but about what a canonical reading of the text should be. There's
Mhm.
different ideas about that. Some are synchronic. I think part of holding together these two pieces should push us more towards a kind of diachronic thinking about what it means to read through and appreciate the unity of the canon. That I think is faithful, at least to some of the grounding intuitions of Brevard Childs, who's kind of
Yep.
behind the canonical reading movement. But that language of canonical reading is subsequent to the text of De Verbum. It doesn't evoke that specifically. But this notion of the unity of the entirety of the scriptures, Old and New Testament. So that breaks us out of the specialization that's also characteristic of present day scholarship and hard to avoid, for that matter. I mean, um, it's an incredibly developed field. The data set is immense, and it's hard not to seek refuge in a kind of specialization.
Yeah. And so Childs is a name that's come across, my radar more for me. I was familiar with Childs already as a Protestant and as I was learning kind of the fields of Protestant biblical theology.
Mhm.
But since kind of understanding, more where's Catholic scholarship at post Vatican II, Childs is a name that as I kind of survey his work, I'm like, man, it really seems like a lot of his project, even on the Protestant side, a lot of his project seems to really match up well with the heartbeat of Dei Verbum.
I think so. I mean, I think he saw in a prescient way a lot of the problems with contemporary, I mean, modern biblical
Mhm.
scholarship as a theological project. He saw that it had lost the legitimacy of theological thought and was working for a way to integrate that with, like I say, a diachronic um, understanding of the development of the texts. And so we wanted to set as the end point of that diachronic development and the object of our reflection, the Bible, the canon as such. And so that gives a kind of parameter to what the telos or the scopos, the object of our study, formal object of our study, ultimately is. So I do think, yeah, it's consonant with. There's very distinctive Protestant accents in his
Mhm.
project as well. I
Yes.
mean, starting with the fact that his canon's different.
Right.
So there's obvious places where we're going to diverge in how we think about some basic things. Nevertheless, it's I think it's a useful paradigm, and he made some immense contributions, and
Mhm.
stands outside in some ways the main. I mean, he's a very respected figure. Obviously, it's a
Yeah.
prestigious place and so forth, but it hasn't had the kind of traction that I'm sure he hoped his work would have. But in any case, that's one element of multiple elements. Although in Child's inflection is already trying to hold on to the historical, as they say.
And I think
The
I was gonna say, I think
Go
you
ahead,
do,
please.
a tremendous job in this book of trying to wed both of those together. Right. So there's both a very clear historical scholarship to what you're doing in this work, that is constantly being brought into the scriptures and the dogmatic beliefs of the church to wed these together. And so, as I kind of ran this by you earlier, but I was like, all right, if I'm trying to big picture summarize like the push of this book, I'd say it's something like, that in order to understanding the nature of the New Testament priesthood requires a sort of canonical reading of the New Testament, fitting it within the light of the Old Testament scriptures. And that while the New Testament can at times appear to abrogate a ministerial priesthood, there is a very reasonable reading that shows, rather than an abrogation of that priesthood, a transformation of the ministerial priesthood. And that's just in light of the new covenant and Jesus's life, death, resurrection, and ascension, where he is now serving as a great high priest of a new order of ministerial priests. Is that about right?
That's very well said. Took me a lot longer to say it. That's very good, and it underlines something. I mean, I also at the beginning of the book avert to a comment, insightful diagnosis of Pope Benedict,
Mhm.
where he talks about this, and this is another asymmetry, but this relationship between the Old Testament and the New is at the center of what we mean by the unity of Scripture and a
Yeah.
canonical reading. And he highlights a tendency, especially in the Lutheran tradition, to have a highly dialectical understanding of gospel against
Mhm.
law, which is going to incline us towards this notion of an abrogation or an opposition. And so finding the right balance there, and I mean finding a Catholic sensibility about what that balance between the old and the new is, what's completely for forever undone, and what's kind of remade. That's a big part of getting this canonical reading and this unity right. So it's from a Catholic perspective, it's going to be a continuity and discontinuity
Yeah.
question, and so that's going to allow us to have the line of continuity. I think that's critical, while recognizing the radical eschatological innovation that is the new covenant itself. So yeah, all of that. There's an immense amount. I mean, in any of these 4 points,
Mhm.
and here we see that a lot of really basic theological orientations are at stake, and hermeneutical exegetical orientations are at stake, in in what we set as our project, and that are going to be the paradigm or the canons of reasonability. So if we say, and I think, yeah, I think there's very reasonable reading, part of showing the rational nature of the way that we're reading the text is to just articulate what these premises or presuppositions
Mhm.
are. So presuppositions about what the relationship between the old and the new really is at root, or what it's not. So there I think there's already a distinctive Catholic, or if you like a distinctive Lutheran or Protestant. I mean, that's a highly variegated category as well, but uh, you could already signal something that's kind of genetically embedded in the way that we're going to approach these texts,
Mhm.
and that's going to yield different results.
Yeah, and that's obviously, got to be the great challenge, right? When we're dealing with texts as old as they are, as varied as they are, and as wide ranging as they are.
Yeah.
At some point, we're going to get down to the question of presuppositions, right? Like, what are you
Hmm.
presupposing as you try to wed all of this material together into one cohesive manner. And so, but again, I think you do a really good job of that, and you spend a good amount of time in the Old Testament laying a foundation for the expectations of the New Testament priesthood that you would say, again, lead to this very reasonable reading. So you talk a bit, you spend some time talking about Leviticus 8 through 10. Right, it's kind of the
Mhm.
center of the Pentateuch and the first priestly ordination. So how does that, or how should that, help us kind of shape and understand our thinking around the priesthood?
This is maybe part of the experimental character of it, but I think it's triggered by the biblical text itself. I mean, so there's already a few decisions here, but the priestly corpus
Yeah,
within the Old Testament is a challenging part of the Bible. It's a lot of laws, but there are these embedded narratives which are very, very important. And this happens to be one of them. It's like you say, right there at the center. Really, I mean, we're at the center of the Pentateuch, and
hmm,
there's something structurally important about that. One of the things that's central to this narrative in Leviticus 8 and 9 is not just the ordination of the first priests, but their immediate failure. And as I say, maybe it's personal, but I think it's triggered by the text. And I think it also responds to a kind of deep and not inaccurate Protestant sensitivity, certainly in the 16th century, but clerical sin is a
sure.
starting point for me. And I think that's actually critical to getting the relationship between the old and the new right. Is to
Mm,
understand that God institutes something that doesn't have a design flaw. I mean, any more than creation itself has a design flaw with the fall. But there's a parallel, in fact, to this elevated order of grace that is the Old Testament priesthood. That no sooner does God make a paradise than the springs start breaking, and it kind of goes off the rails a little bit. And so this Felix culpa notion that somehow plan B is God's plan A, and ultimately this purified priesthood is present from the very beginning. This new form of that which from the very beginning is somehow inevitably imperfect. That's something to talk about when I get to the prophets a little bit. Start with the
mhm,
Pentateuch. So there's diachronic ways in which actually the positioning of these two isn't isn't the narrative read. The prophets are usually understood to be um, in terms of strict chronology prior to a lot of these texts.
mhm,
Anyway, their critique of priestly sin now has a different context, and the first word that we get, at least in the narrative flow that we encounter, puts us right in the face of this. And there's a lot of ways you can analyze the character of this priestly sin. It's mysteriously elusive, actually, in the text of Leviticus itself, which I think is it's suggestively capacious.
mm,
That you can fill whatever you want into that, and the character of it isn't the priesthood itself. It's not that God made a mistake in making the priests. It's that we can't bear the weight of glory that's proper to the priesthood. And so the teleology of the priesthood is also immediately revealed as, in fact, a mechanism for the manifestation of God's glory. It's a theophonic
mhm.
entity within the order of God's salvific design. And so, holding that kind of firmly in view as well, I think also kind of gives us um, a vector to find our way to a Christological theophany that's also kind of the end point determined already from the start.
And I appreciate that parallel that, just because there was an immediate sin and fall in creation, that doesn't make creation necessarily bad, right? And for the same way, right? Just because even with the priesthood, even because there was an immediate fall, that doesn't mean the institution of the priesthood is itself bad, right? So something I thought as I was reading that I had not seen before, and you make note of this a few times, is the importance of the vestments themselves as being ritual space, right? So we
Hmm.
see in that when these vestments are made, they're made of the same material as the tabernacle. What significance does that have? Like, what is being communicated there?
It's highly evocative. I mean, it's another one of these things that, I mean, in the course of writing it too, it became more present to me. But just how present actually the symbol of the priestly vestments is,
Mhm.
not just in the Pentateuch, but it's there from the very beginning. And this link between the priest and the temple, and thereby to the sacrifice, is very very prominent in the instructions given to Moses, the character of these things that the priests themselves wear. But the priest himself, is basically wearing temple veils,
Mhm.
and in that way, kind of transformed into a temple, a little temple. He becomes a kind of synecdoche for the temple, or vice versa. There's a lot of interesting ways in which the symbol gets played with, again and again, and the investment with these vestments, in a particular way, is played out as the the symbolic transmission of, this inhabitation of the ritual space that is the place of sacrifice. So, it's set out as a kind of symbolic lexicon there at the beginning. The first time we see the priest. I mean, I know there's these other questions. I mean, this would be another way to come at this in terms of patriarchal sacrifice and so forth.
Mhm.
But in terms of this formal institution, the first time that the priests, as priests, step on the stage, it's, I mean, the curtain goes up, with them wearing the curtain, and this gives us, as I say, the symbolic lexicon that we also need to kind of hang on to see what the prophets, and then, ultimately, I think what we see in the New Testament,
So,
to put those pieces in place.
so would it be fair to say that sort of the image that sort of is intended there is that in the same way that in the tabernacle we have this sort of overlap of heaven and earth, so too in the priesthood, right? There's something of heaven and earth being mixed together, and that's being shown or symbolized through these vestments. That overlap, that wedding, so to speak, is happening there.
Yeah, I think that's very fair, and I mean it's closely related to this notion already mentioned about, the kind of theophanic character of the priesthood. I
Mhm.
mean, the temple itself is a theophany, and the
Yeah.
pinnacle really of this Pentateuchal, narrative is the investment of glory into the temple, and that's actually very closely connected to the structure of this institution of the priesthood itself. Is, I mean, there's a little mini Sinai moment where the glory of the Lord descends on the sacrifice, and the priests aren't finally made. The priesthood isn't complete until they offer this sacrifice that
Mhm.
manifests God's glory. And so all of that is a unity, and again, kind of pulling out one part of it, is going to lead us to one or the other kind of imbalance. But that also means pulling out the priesthood and trying to hold on to the efficacious sacrifice that's ultimately, a revelation of God's glory, is also just going to pull the rug out from under, the not just the set of symbols, but I mean the sacramental reality. I mean, it's created reality, and a salvific history that is ultimately the skeleton, the character, of the new covenant as well.
Yeah, so I'm sitting here thinking, all this sounds great on paper, right? Even from a couple thousand years out, I'm like, man, this sounds great on paper, right? That theophanic vision, that heaven and earth and the priesthood and all of that, and but obviously, it doesn't take a whole lot of digging to realize that priests are messy, right? And
Right.
so, but this is not a reality that is new to us. That's very much alive in the prophets as well, right? So even within the Old Testament, you do a good job pointing out that even there, there's an awareness that the priests are messy, right? And that there's
Right.
this call to renewal, especially in Hosea. So talk to us a little bit about that kind of antagonism there
Hmm.
between a messy priesthood and that theophanic vision for the priesthood.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's back to this question of kind of Felix culpa. I mean, there's an impossibility, of this finite creature carrying the full glory of of God. I mean, that's the problem with the temple here. That's also the problem with the priesthood that's not as strong as God himself, which is
Yeah.
ultimately what's going to get us to Christ's high priesthood. I mean, the only one who can fulfill this role is the one who can bear all of God's glory. Yeah, the exposure of that, and this is very important. I mean, the scriptures don't let us be blinded by the glory of the priesthood. So, I mean, the Pentateuch and the priestly writers glorify themselves, and in with just reason. I mean, there's this glory, the sons of Aaron and all their glory.
Mhm.
I mean, Sirach is a kind of reprise of all of that. I mean, but there's this astonishment with the beauty of the priesthood and the beauty of the temple liturgy that can blind you. And this is, one of the perpetual issues of clerical sin or something like
Mhm.
that. Is okay, you're so enthralled by that you don't see the humanity involved. So yeah, the prophets play a very critical role in exposing that. Here is where I think getting our canonical equilibrium correct is really critical. So this deposit in the scriptures played a big role in the 16th century. Like, it's really
Mhm.
easy to pull text and say priests
Yeah.
are terrible,
Yeah.
therefore there's no priesthood or something like that. That's a non sequitur, and I think it's not just a theological non sequitur; it's also an exegetical non sequitur. When we read the prophets, it's highly anachronistic
Yeah.
to suppose that they imagined religion without priests or sacrifice. What they wanted was a priesthood and a sacrifice that wasn't burdened by these sins. Okay, and that's a legitimate aspiration, though an aspiration that is a transcendent aspiration. That's why God Himself is ultimately the fulfillment of the prophet's claims. But one of the things I try to highlight there, and I take it from another scholar, Gianni David, but the notion of this antagonism hypothesis,
Mhm.
which is a kind of Enlightenment idea of universal religion that just doesn't make any sense in the ancient Near East, where the the problem wasn't that there were priests. The problem is that priests weren't acting like priests should. It's a
Yeah.
very different perspective, and it gives us a different kind of key into these complaints that we hear, not just in Hosea, but across the prophets. Um, the one thing we do see, and I think it's also a very important point we're stressing, even in Hosea, and when we read these things in context, is that you, um, Jefferson said, "You get the rulers that you deserve." I mean, you get the priests that you deserve, and the priests are a concentrated expression of the people. I mean, that's what they do. That's why they have that role. But that's also they bear the sins of a society
Right.
um, in their lives and in their persons. And so it's also just irresponsible and incorrect to kind of offload all of that, to offshore all the problems and the sins on the clerical caste and say, no, the people are fine, the priests are the problem. No, the priests are the problem because the people are the problem, and vice
Yeah.
versa. And that too, I think, is a shift that we need to make in the way that we understand this kind of prophetic um, challenge of the priesthood, is that it actually goes much deeper than just a clerical caste. I mean, the people
Yeah.
themselves are being brought into court before God, and it's an escape mechanism if you draw a sociological boundary and put yourself on the safe side of that.
Yeah, so there's more of a unity there, almost as representative of the people and at the same time representative of God for the people coming to kind of crashing together in that moment. And like you say, it could be easy. I don't want to be uncharitable here, but it could be easy to sort of cherry pick the prophets to say, well, look, here, bad experience, bad experience, bad experience. We've got some scripture that really rails against these guys. Therefore, no more, priesthood in the New Testament. But if we read more of the prophets, it's not that simple, right? Because there's expectations moving forward. Um, and so as you get into Zechariah, you key in on the importance or the significance of the changing of the high priestly vestments in
Yeah.
Zechariah. So what should we be picking up there? What was the expectation around that time and the understanding
Mhm.
of this change of priestly vestments, since those themselves are so important?
Right. Yeah, I mean, so there we have. I mean, juxtaposed to this kind of ethical critique is a prophetic vision in the strongest sense, an anticipation of a future promise and fulfillment. And one of the characters that it takes is again kind of re-invoking this symbolic lexicon of the vestments. And so this transformation of Joshua, and it's not incidental certainly to an early Christian mind and even a postmodern Christian mind that the name of
Mhm.
this high priest is Jesus.
Mhm.
But so these soiled vestments that he's found in are evocative of all the degradation of all the institutions of Israel. I mean, the priesthood, yes, but the monarchy, all of the effects of the exile, which are the effect of the people's sin. They're leaders, but leaders of the people. And so seeing the high priest, which is the very glory of the people, reduced to this state of desolation, is expressive of an embodiment of that, and a porting of all of that sin, but then also, which is to say, all the effects of all of those sins from that first sin in Leviticus 8 and 9, and the transformation is this magnificent image metaphor of the undoing of
Yeah.
all of the effects of that sin, and through the recreation of the dignity of that high priesthood. So that I think is a big part of what's happening in that vision, is that we're seeing the new priesthood. We're seeing the priesthood of Jesus Christ forecast.
Yeah. Well, and to me, what just keeps coming to mind is, even the parallel with creation, right? Creation is made good. There's a fall, but what we're not looking towards is an ultimate destruction of the creation that is fallen, but a transformation and a new glorification of all of creation. And so it seems like you could take a very parallel
Mhm.
line with the priesthood itself, right? Priesthood
Yes,
fall, and we're not destroying that priesthood now, but we're looking forward to a renewal, a transformation, a transfiguration of that into the glory that it was intended to have.
that's right. And it I mean, it's worth noting, I mean, how focused, Second Temple Jewish
Mhm.
expectation is on exactly this
Yeah.
as the articulation of the embodiment of God's faithfulness. So this expectation of an eschatological high priest becomes
Mhm.
very, very pronounced, and it's really, I mean, essential to understand the New Testament, because it's in everyone's heads. It's in all these texts. I mean, this is one of the big things we get from Qumran and other places. I mean, our eyes are open to see how attentively they were awaiting that priest and that priesthood, and that type of reformation. So, I mean, it would be a peculiar thing if all of that was just misguided, and all of the expectation of God's people was just wrong. No, in fact, there's not going to be, nope, there's none of that coming. So we get these prophetic glimmers, but then they gain speed. There's a kind of snowballing effect, that brings us through this, late, it's not intra testamental,
Mhm.
but this moment that brings us to the brink of the new covenant, which is a kind of amplification of that same vision, restated in all kinds of different ways. So some pretty extraordinary ways, honestly. I mean, the language of this new priesthood is very, very pervasive.
Yeah, and so one of the sort of biblical through lines that I seem to kind of keep seeing pop up was a connection between a couple of sets of scripture, right? So you've got Deuteronomy 18:15, right, where
Hmm.
we're talking about that and that person who will be raised up like Moses, right? Then you've got First Samuel 2:35, Zechariah 3 that we just talked about, and then also Malachi 2 and 3. So what
Hmm.
is the kind of through line of those passages as you kind of work your way across the Old Testament, leading us up to Christ, that early Christians would have been picking up on?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those all of those texts kind of resonate in different directions. I mean, very foundational is this text in Deuteronomy 18.
Mhm.
A prophet like Moses is going to be raised up. There's a lot of different things in there that have echoes in subsequent Jewish thought interpretation. But one of the ways that gets appropriated and amplified is as a kind of understanding of of a new Moses in the guise of a priest who was
Mhm.
raised up. Um, this text in 1 Samuel 2:35 is actually very, very interesting. It's another one of these kind of Deuteronomistic embedded prophecies, but it's playing in its own way off of Deuteronomy 18 and kind of giving us the first key that suddenly that's been reinterpreted as the raising up of a new priest. Um, that that will become more and more explicit to the point where we get these non-canonical texts, which are very revealing, not in an inspired sense, but
Mhm.
we'll get these visions of the new priest, just as kind of a title of the eschatological agent of God who will come in the end time. So this transformation of the prophet being raised up becomes a priest that's raised up. There's other ways that is at work. And Ezra and Nehemiah will have the same sort of thing where you'll get this priest scribe kind of put in the shape of the new Moses, and his priesthood then will kind of accrue to that figure. So there's a lot of different things at work in this. In Maccabees, it's at work, but it has achieved a kind of crystal clarity by the turn of the era that the raising up of the new priest will be the raising up of the new Moses will be a new priest. In fact, that text from 1 Samuel 2:35 is cited directly in Hebrews
Mhm.
in application to Jesus as the new priest. So, like, we're being given all the lines we need to follow and see exactly who this is and what's being fulfilled there. It's interesting. I mean, we're given all these, but we don't see all of them. I just sat on a board for a dissertation in Vienna on those first two chapters of Hebrews and on the priesthood of Jesus there, and he didn't see that. And I mentioned that in defense, like there's this, so it's you need to kind of have your eyes open to see it, but the signals are all there, and like I say, the full revelation of the guy who fulfills all of these expectations is given to us in Hebrews, but in the New Testament. The same Moses thing is obviously informing Malachi. There's even
Yeah.
more going on there in chapters 2 and 3 of Malachi, but the final verses of Malachi are expecting these eschatological figures who are getting blended in different ways. The messenger at the end of Malachi is being read through the ideal Levite in chapter 2, and those two figures are
Mhm.
getting fused so that whoever this final Elijah figure is, and Elijah is also at the same time turning into a priest for the Second Temple Jewish mind, is becoming one with this same new priest. So you have this massive kind of agglutination of expected figures, and it's focusing more and more and more on the priestly identity, but it's a prophet priest. There's kingly dimensions to this we can mention as well, but this constellation, especially through Deuteronomy 18, is giving us a Mosaic priest, an eschatological Mosaic priest who's supposed to come at the end time. And I mean, these passages from Malachi are how the Gospels begin. So
Mhm.
again, we're giving all the signals, the reference of where exactly we are canonically, where we are in terms of prophetic expectation, and where we are is the answer to the dirty clad priest. We're getting the new glorious priest.
Yeah, and so as we move into some of these New Testament texts now and see how Christ is the fulfillment of that, one of the places that I've just seen a lot of scholarship going here lately, interestingly, is the Transfiguration. I read another great book recently by is actually a Protestant scholar on a biblical theology of the Transfiguration. I thought it was fantastic work. And there's some others that are coming out that are kind of focusing on even an exegetical model based on the Transfiguration. But you spend some time on the Transfiguration and looking at it as a new priestly ordination. And so, what are you seeing there?
Yeah, I mean, a number of things. I mean, so part of the argument there is, tracing this line of expectation, which puts us in the company of these two figures who show up
Hmm.
on Mount Tabor there. So, I mean, it's a narrative staging of the end of Malachi. So, I mean, this is already disposing us to think scripturally through that kind of a text. We're also in the presence of an extraordinary symbol, and not a symbol that we haven't seen before, and that's these vestments.
Hmm.
The transformation of Jesus' vestments is not usually given a lot of attention in the exegesis, though it's given a lot of attention in the text. And so I think they're one of the simple things to do. And you can do this beyond the scriptural, triggers. You can show that just as the Jews of the time were expecting this high priestly figure, they're also fascinated by the priestly vestments. I mean, we have these texts from Qumran and so forth. They thought a lot about this stuff. It was on their minds. It was in their expectations, and so that, I think, is it's certainly the best candidate for understanding whatever is going on with this transformation of his clothes. Like, why?
Yeah.
Okay, it's light, it's glory, it's theophany, which is also one of the things we're expecting, but through this particular symbol. So that's part of the argument there as well. There's another dimension to it, and that is the way these traditions of ordination were articulated
Mm.
in ancient Jewish texts. There's a lot of different kind of competing ways that you get ordained as a priest in the thought of the time, and one of them is by heavenly journey. Okay, by a kind of ascension
Mhm.
into the heights. In fact, we have a fantastic, it's very fragmentary, like a lot of texts of Qumran, but a tremendous example where Moses going to the top of Sinai and penetrating through the clouds is understood as his ordination.
Mm.
It's very, very important and revealing. James Kugel has a nice text where he talks about overkill, that you can be ordained in lots of different ways. In the testament of Levi is also transformed by being brought into heaven, and in fact, getting new priestly garments. So he goes up into heaven and he's reclothed as a priest. So I think these are the kind of suggestions of the context for understanding of this heavenly journey into the cloud of God's glory, and this revelation and investment with glory in the company of these two guys who are being understood as the eschatological forerunners of this purified Levite, this purified priesthood. That all of that comes together just in a compelling, difficult. It's difficult to resist the kind of convergence of themes that is focused on that event in the Transfiguration. Um, that there's a few other things, but I mean those are kind of the major lines of why I think that's a credible way to understand that particular, obviously critical event there
Yeah.
in the center of the Gospels.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I thought was interesting that you brought out that I hadn't seen somebody kind of go into detail before was Peter's action in attempting to build the shelters. Typically, when I've seen somebody discuss this, they sort of just scoff at Peter or ridicule him a bit for his choice to attempt to build shelters there. But you seem to be seeing, a little bit more that there's a real intention and a context behind this idea of building booths that Peter's attempting to do.
Yeah, I mean, so that's another element that I wouldn't make a weight bearing element on its own, but in
Mm.
the context of these kind of converging themes, it takes on a different resonance, and that's the ordination of the priest, and their investment with these garments at the
Mhm.
time of the Feast of Booths. And so, if the reference puts us there, then suddenly a lot of things click. other giant thing that clicks that I forgot to mention is that God quotes Deuteronomy 15. He's
Mhm.
telling us that this is the fulfillment of that. So there's just so many things that display a kind of coherence if we take them in this priestly line. Then yes, Peter's statement too, although it is bumbling, that's not to be discounted,
Right.
is nevertheless suggestive of the interpretive context that's being revealed. So I think that's a way that we can um, recontextualize Peter's statement as soon as we understand that the larger context here is cosmic ordination to eschatological priesthood.
Very good. And so, um, the thrust of that chapter in particular is going towards John 21:17 and the reinstitution of Peter and the charge to feed Christ's sheep. And so, talk to us a little bit about the good shepherd or the shepherd image itself, right? I mean, this is in the Old Testament, this is more than just somebody who tended sheep in a pasture, right? I mean, the
Hmm.
the shepherd symbol itself was very evocative of some bigger themes.
Sure. Um, yeah, I mean, so this is also different ways that the Gospels. I mean, you have your synoptic idiom, and here you have a very
Mhm.
Johannine, very distinctive Johannine idiom. I think he also does stuff actually with the garments. I mean, the Passion of Christ, but in a particular way, he does concentrate on this notion of the shepherd in chapter 10, and then again in chapter 21. And as you say, it's I mean, it's not an incidental motif. It's not a saccharine kind of benign motif of pastoral life or rural life or something like that. Just Davidic simplicity. I mean, there's I forget all the things I say there, but I mean, there's this entire ancient Near Eastern background of kings as shepherds, and
Yeah.
it's a fantastically hierarchical notion. In fact, I mean, I also mentioned these papyri that we have of shepherds. They're very, very class conscious of who's the super shepherd. Okay, so you have the over shepherd, the under shepherds, and all these different classes and so forth. And so I think again, just having a kind of less anachronistic sense of what's evoked by these symbols puts us in a better position to sense some of the nuances that are present, and also some things that are not just being brushed away because we don't know what the shepherd symbol meant back then. Um, so yes.
Well, I thought one of the things that you draw is the contrast with Caiaphas, right? Who was high priest for that year, and the that role of Caiaphas as sort of the anti. It's fair to say the anti shepherd in
Hmm.
contrast with the good shepherd of Christ.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot going on there. In fact, there's also stuff I don't have in the book there that is very, very interesting, especially in John 18. But there's a few lexical signals that were given in the way that you're passing through the door and coming into the alleyway
Mhm.
to the space. So the language that's used to describe Caiaphas' space is the same
Mhm.
language that we got in John chapter 10, but we're seeing a direct inversion. So instead of laying down his life, he's the one who's going to sacrifice the Lamb of God. And so, I mean, particularly when we see that John 10 and John 21 are evoking Ezekiel 34 and the bad shepherds, and
Mhm.
I'm going to give you a good shepherd. In fact, I'm going to be that good shepherd. Then what we have is the bad shepherd and the good shepherd. We have those kind of mercenary, self-serving leaders that we saw in the Old Testament, in especially in this case through the language of Ezekiel 35, who slaughter the sheep. And so I think that's one of the elements that's going on there. Um, Caiaphas' story, Peter's story, and Jesus' story are all tangled up in
Mhm.
a pretty extraordinary way. Um, eh, yeah, I don't go into all the depth there because, like I said, chapter 18 is really, really intricate in the way it's setting up Peter's commissioning in chapter 21. And that at least is the kind of key point to get to, is that
Yeah.
Jesus gives all of this. It's not just that he's the, the super priest or the super shepherd. He transforms this. Should also just add in parentheses that this pastoral language becomes a privileged language in the early church for talking about cultic governance within the community, and so it's not incidental. But it's also not without reference. It's not just metaphor. It's the emergence of a kind of technical language, and so this commissioning of Peter is also, important in that context of a transfer of office, a transfer of power.
Yeah, so let's go there, right? So in this passage, right, we're seeing that kind of recommissioning of Peter, bringing him back into the fold. That threefold back and forth question, right? Do you love me? And you spent some time wading through that. So, why is it a reasonable reading of this passage to see Christ, transferring this priesthood upon now those who will follow after him?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I take distance from is I don't see this as principally about the papacy. I see it
Mhm.
as something bigger, or if you prefer, I see the papacy about something more abstract, as high priesthood within the church itself, the visible
Mhm.
church, participation in Jesus' priesthood. Um, there's a lot there's a lot that needs to be said here that I mean, see the clock there and can't say it all. I mean, what's very very clear, and one thing I'm at pains to make is that this commissioning of Peter isn't a revelation of Peter's failure, but it's an initiation of Peter into communion with Christ's death, which is to say that the love that he shows, and there's these two words that are moving back and forth, and I think they're frequently kind of they're not correctly parsed. I think what we're being told is that Peter is being initiated into that greatest love, which lays down its life for its
Mhm.
friends, which is this love of chapter 10, which is love that Christ, the Good Shepherd, showed, which is the opposite of that other high priest, Caiaphas. So we're getting a new version, and through Ezekiel 34, replacement of the one priesthood by the other. Okay,
Right.
here again, this is kind of a critical thing, and why Caiaphas does play a key role. It's very, very, very interesting that in Jesus' trial, you have this interlacing. This is back in chapter 18, but this interlacing of the testing of Jesus and the testing of Peter. So you have a
Mm.
scene of Jesus, a scene of Peter. But what we never see, and it's central to the synoptic scenes, and I'm quite certain that John is giving us this intentionally, is we never see Jesus before Caiaphas. Instead, what we get is Jesus taken to Caiaphas, Peter in his final denial, and then Jesus taken from Caiaphas, which is to say that Jesus before Caiaphas is filled, the place of that is filled by Peter in his denial. And his
Mm.
denial is the exact inversion of Jesus' confession at that moment, as we know it from the synoptics and as pervades the entire gospel of John, which is to say, the very moment Jesus is saying, I am, Peter is saying, I am not. It's extraordinary. I mean, it's magnificent elegance. Through the failure of Peter, we hear the success of Jesus. Okay, and the failure of him in that moment of trial is somehow perfected by this self-offering of Jesus, and that is all in the background in chapter 21,
Mhm.
in which that failure is undone. And it's also not incidental. What's the metaphor, the language for this participation in Jesus' death that Peter is now going to be called to live, is going to be closed and taken where he does not wish to go. So I mean, there's even this sense again of the kind of investure in precisely this moment in which Jesus is being disclosed. Okay, so anyway, there's a great deal going on. It's very subtle, it's very elegant, but it's fundamentally the undoing of an order of priesthood that is embodied by this bad priest,
Mhm.
Caiaphas, who represents an entire order, its embodiment through Jesus, and then its transfer of that same shepherding power, shepherding responsibility, shepherding role. That is to say, the fulfillment of Ezekiel 34 is put in Peter's hands. I mean, that's the simplest way to say it, is the fulfillment of the prophecy of Ezekiel 34 is perfected in Jesus, despite Peter's failure, and then put in Peter's hands. That's what's happening, and that's a tremendous thing.
I love that. And again, anybody listening to this, pick up your Bible and read, right? Like let's go kind of see where these through lines and connection points happen. And we are running a bit, long on time here. But I still do want to talk about this, last piece here in the spiritual temple, the holy priesthood. So how do the later New Testament texts discuss this? And you say something I thought to me was pretty powerful on page 210 of the book. You said that scholars have a habit of speaking of the New Testament literature as literature of Second Temple Judaism. And then you say it would in many ways be more accurate, both historically and theologically speaking, to perceive instead the dawn of a post-temple Judaism, right? And I think you're the first person I've seen bring that up in the idea that these New Testament texts aren't just Second Temple texts, but this temple was destroyed, right? And so how is it that this new Christian cult is going to think theologically in a post-temple era? And we see a lot of that coming together in the book of Hebrews. And then also, you focus in on, 1 Peter 2:5. But you seem to spend some time discussing, why the language around temple and priests changes. Uh, Feel free to comment on
Yeah,
that.
yeah. I actually gave a whole paper on that in Rome this summer, which will be coming out. So I've continued to think about this kind of reconceptualization of the New Testament itself. And I've said Second Temple plenty of times. I mean, there's ways in
Sure.
which that paradigm still holds. But I mean, one of the things indicated there is the newness,
Mhm.
and so we don't want to underplay, as much as we're talking about this continuity, the radical newness of religion that doesn't slaughter animals.
Mhm.
Okay, and that's back to this antagonism, like the prophets couldn't have imagined it. And the appearance of this is very, very startling, and it has a lot to do with what we just saw here. This shift, which can be destabilizing. Okay, suddenly this shift to this shepherding language from classical. Why don't we just say priest? Peter, you're a priest. Okay,
Mhm.
you're the fulfillment of Psalm 110. You're the priest according to the order of Melchizedek. I mean, so one of the things that's at stake here is, I mean, the the challenge, and it's a big challenge that touches a lot of New Testament interpretation, but of early Christians trying to articulate exactly that newness, without a ready-made lexicon, and with an old lexicon that was in danger of a lot of the wrong resonance. So one of the things that, I mean, the language of priests meant, was, biological Levite,
Mhm.
member of a particular clan, guy who was part of this kind of soil and blood religion, that is no longer operative. And so, I mean, there's a major risk of evoking all of that, and I think that
Yeah.
has a heck of a lot to do with why that language isn't fronted, and why new language, this pastoral language, is advanced and used as a kind of principal idiom, not the exclusive idiom, because there's lots of ways in which that old language does still resonate, and Paul deploys it in lots of different ways. I mean, talk about some important texts there in First Corinthians and elsewhere, Romans as well, where we have this kind of language, but it's deployed carefully,
Mhm.
and usually with with the necessary Christological asterisks. So in any case, we don't get that kind of language, though we do hang on to, and I think you were pushing towards First Peter 2 there. You
Mhm.
did get this kind of general language of a priestly people, okay,
Yeah.
and that's played a big role in a lot of these kind of controversial or polemical debates and Catholic Protestant debates. Okay, well there it is, and the people are priests instead of priests being priests.
Right.
Um, and they're again, I mean, I think there's other ways that we can understand both the big movement, but also the text there in First Peter 2, which I really just don't see indicating that everything that belonged to the priestly class is being abrogated through a transfer to the whole people or something like that. It's entirely new covenant language. I mean, the resonance is there through Exodus 19 and 24. I mean, there's a few things you need to do, I think, to unlock that, and it's a complicated passage in First Peter. There, he's citing a lot of texts, but he ends there again with a Hosea thing of you are no people, now you're turned into a people. I mean, it's the creation of a new covenant people, um, and if that's a priestly people, how is it that there isn't a priesthood there at its heart? There's a few things there I think we just need to pause over. But so there is a way that priestly language is still deployed, but there's also a way in which it really couldn't be deployed, and we just need to kind of recognize the socio-historical circumstances in which new Christian language is being developed to talk about continuity and discontinuity, and that's what we're watching that transpire in the New Testament.
Yeah, and so, speaking of that continuity and discontinuity, I mean, again, if we're looking for a reasonable reading of Scripture, in the Old Testament, the Israel was a priestly people as well, right? They were all priests in a real sense, but that did not negate there being a ministerial priesthood. And so, if we're saying that there is a, in some sense, structural continuity, right? That the new covenant people are also priests out to the world. That in no way negates a ministerial priesthood to shepherd those priests, right? I mean, there's a parallel
Yeah.
structure there.
Yeah, Peter. I mean, that's the thing. Peter's citing the Old Testament. I mean, that's
Yeah.
the kind of irony in Martin Luther's move on this text. Is like that's not actually. I mean, it's a New Testament appropriation of an Old Testament text, but it's an Testament thing, and it doesn't apply in the sense that you think in the context in Exodus. So I don't understand the jump in logic, I suppose, to enforce that application in the New, unless you have this very, very strong law versus gospel presupposition.
Yeah. And so maybe we'll kind of wrap it up on this idea in Hebrews 13, right? We see this passage that we have an altar from which those who officiate in the tent have no right to eat. Right. So, we're getting this altar language, and right. I mean, who serves at an altar? A priest. Right. And now, perhaps somebody could argue, well, yeah, I mean, but that's Jesus, the great high priest in heaven. But then, the question in my mind is extended. Well, then how do I actually access that altar and partake of it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very good, fair question. A book that came out after this one, which is very, very interesting for helping us think about this. Actually, is by a professor of early Christian archaeology in Rome, Stefan
Mm,
Heid. It's been translated now into English. Um, Altar and Church, Altar and Kirche, Altar and Church, and one of the things that he does, and it's very, very interesting. Just had an exchange last evening with a petrologist about this. Is he makes a very, very strong case uh, that we've really misconceived the context of the early Christian cult through
mm,
a scholarly fabrication of house churches
mm.
that haven't recognized the existence of the trapeza, which means table,
Okay.
as a primitive altar. So his entire argument, and it's actually compelling in a lot of ways, is that Um, the early Christians had a consecrated altar for these meals that they had. It was a movable altar, but it was reserved exclusively to cultic use, understood as an altar, in the same way that you had these movable altars for unbloody sacrifice, also in the pagan the temples. The exchange with the patrologist yesterday was, she said, I always thought, like everyone did, that when Ignatius speaks about the altar, it's purely symbolic. I said, yeah, it's interesting. If you read Hyde, he doesn't think so. He thinks there was actually an altar, like in every Christian community, and um, it's how do you I mean, one can read his book, but there's a very strong line of continuity in his attempts to show the primordial character of the cultic in Christian worship that I think we are in danger of missing when we over spiritualize or render purely symbolic a lot of this language. So I think the blood language, the altar language, even the flesh of Jesus language that we get in Hebrews is so profoundly resonant
Yeah.
with a third element. I never got to the other two of the last two of Dave Verboom's guidelines, but another element that's very, very critical in the Catholic approach, and that's tradition within the living tradition. And we have this living tradition of worship that's instinctively capable of recognizing things,
Yeah.
that it's always recognized, and that stands in firm continuity of praxis. And if we allow that also to be part of the one of the parameters of our own exegesis, then language of altar, language of sacrificial blood and participation therein, just like language of washing with water. Like, okay, yeah, Protestants can't miss washing with water. Okay, Catholics can't miss blood and altars.
Hmm.
Um, and so the language just carries that force, and maybe not just through living tradition, but maybe even through material culture, if Stefan Hyde is right.
And it really seems to just kind of tie into that idea of a two-tiered liturgy that we see very much present throughout the Old Testament, right? I mean, so when the temple worship is taking place, there's this understanding that heaven and earth are meeting in this place, and that in some real sense, the liturgy of the earth that is taking place on earth is mirroring the liturgy of heaven in some sense. It's participating in it. And I know for me personally, that was an idea that struck me profoundly. That when we get into the New Testament cult, that two-tiered liturgy doesn't just disappear. Right, heaven does not stop overlapping with earth, and that in fact that liturgy is now going to be distributed around the world. Right, so once the temple is destroyed, it's not that there's now no place to go experience this liturgy of heaven. It's that it is now being dispersed around the world as the Christian community moves. And so yeah, for me, as you're talking altar and these things, it's like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, if that two-tiered liturgy continues to take place upon the altar, and we have this altar, um, then this is, the real sense in which the liturgy of heaven is going to be moving throughout the world in the way
Mhm.
that Christians worship and participate in that heavenly liturgy.
That's exactly right. I mean, and it's a critical point, because I mean, it's a both and. I mean,
Yeah.
the altar is the heavenly altar,
Yes.
and the extraordinary thing in Hebrew, there's a lot of extraordinary, but is that the bloodless worship that belonged to the angels in the heavenly cult of the old. I mean, it was always bloodless, is now stained with Jesus' blood. He takes blood and his flesh into that altar. So it's really the interpenetration of these two liturgies in the person of Jesus and through the person of Jesus. And yeah, then the question: how do you participate in that? I
Yeah.
mean, that's in
Yes.
the subtitle of the book there, but precisely because it's a post-temple religion, and you don't participate just at the address, here, one Temple Mount. I mean, but you can participate everywhere in the world. That's why the participation of every altar, in that sense of the trapeza of a worshiping Christian community, is a participation and an access point to the one heavenly altar.
Yeah. And so if those altars are tied, to that heavenly altar, that ultimate sacrifice, if this is a place where, in a real sense, Calvary reaches forward and is applied to us. Well, the biblical language and the biblical type there is that there is a priest applying that, right? And so, um, Father Anthony, this book has been phenomenal. It has really helped me try to think biblically about all these things. I know it went a little bit long here, but we really did not even touch on by any means everything that you talk about in this book, right? This was kind of a brief walkthrough of 6 of the kind of main chapters in this book, but there's also 10 more excursus that you take off of those chapters to really do the work to fill in the blanks and try to make as much context as possible to show why all of this is a very reasonable reading of Scripture. And again, I think you've done a great job at that. Is it going to change people's minds? Maybe, maybe not. At minimum, I think this is going to be a great strengthening, to the church, and will at least give those who maybe have been anti-Catholic in their kind of priestly views, something to chew on from the Scripture as it relates to the office of ministerial priesthood in the New Testament.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today. And again, highly recommend anybody go pick up this book and take it, read, and enjoy. Thank you again.
Thank you.